This episode is brought to you by Manscaped. It's summertime, and the trimming is easy. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to announce that Smooth Sack Summer is officially upon us. When you're playing in the summer sun, make sure that you're groomed from pubes to bum. Thanks to our friends at Manscaped, you can make this season your smoothest yet. The Performance Package 5.0 Ultra is the ultimate bundle to keep your boys downstairs cool while looking hot. Join the 10 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped with our exclusive offer. Get 20% off and free shipping when you go to manscaped.com and use the code DARKAGES. Now, I've been a fan of a well-groomed nether region for years, and I've tried lots of ways to get the right look. From safety razors, they work, but they're scary, safe or not, to depilatory cream, which I absolutely do not recommend. Manscaped sent me the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra. I've had it for about a month now, and it is by far the best way of keeping things clean that I have found. It has everything you need to prepare that summer bod. Inside the package, you will find the star of the show, the Lawn Mower 5.0 Ultra. Their 5th generation trimmer features 2 interchangeable next-gen skin-safe blade heads, a standard one for taking just a little bit off the top, and the new foil blade to go smooth wherever your heart desires. We also have dual LED spotlights to provide contrast on multiple skin tones, 3 length-setting combs, and the trimmer is waterproof. Now that you have the perfect haircut, you can use Manscaped's liquid formulations to keep that freshness even at the hottest of summer barbecues. The Crop Soother Aftershave Lotion and the Crop Preserver Anti-Chafe Deodorant. Manscaped even threw in 2 free gifts to the Performance Package 5.0, the Manscaped Boxers and the Shed Travel Bag. Comfy, breathable undies? Always welcome. And the travel bag I used just this weekend on a little overnight jaunt with Mrs. Dark Ages. It's all good stuff. So get 20% off plus free shipping with the code DARKAGES at manscaped.com. That's 20% off plus free shipping with the code DARKAGES at manscaped.com. It's Smooth Sack Summer, boys. Get on board. Hello, and welcome to the Dark Ages podcast, episode 48, The Kingdom of the Suevi. Last time we talked about the provinces of Hispania, rich and insulated for most of their time inside the empire, and turned upside down by the invasion of the Vandals, Alans, Suevi, and Visigoths in the early years of the 5th century. On this podcast, the Vandals and Visigoths have gotten the most love, and will continue to, if I'm honest. But for this episode, the Suevi will at last have a moment to shine. I've done the Suevi dirty. Of all the tribes I've mentioned over the course of the last 47 episodes, the Suevi have had the longest history of interaction with the Romans, but have barely had an entire paragraph to themselves in these pages, much less a whole episode. They've been kind of an appendage to the other hordes that have come up, tagging along with Vandals as they made their way across the Rhine in 406 and into Hispania in 409, only to disappear into the upper left corner of the map and be mostly ignored. I think I may have even used the phrase, "they're not bothering anybody," at some point, and in this, I was so very wrongity, wrong. So, we have to start, of course, with the question, who are the Suevi, and how do you spell their name, before we move on to the question of the kingdom that they established in Galicia and their conflicts with the locals and the other barbarian groups with whom they share the peninsula. We are not going to get all the way to the ultimate destruction of the Suevi kingdom, but we will hit the highlights of their history, and when we do get to that moment in a later episode, you'll at least have some idea of what was destroyed. Quickly, let me shout out to Francisco, who emailed me from Portugal the other day and expressed his excitement for this episode, as you never get to hear about the Suevi because the Visigoths hog all the limelight. I hope I can give you some insight and fill in some gaps for you, Francisco. Though it is possible that you might already know all there is to know, because the source material for the Suevi kingdom, in particular, is sparse indeed. So now you're all excited and nodding your heads as you jog or commute or whatever, and ask, okay, so who are the Suevi, and where did they come from, and how do you spell it? And my answer comes back, oh my god, you guys. To start with the spelling/pronunciation issue. You will see Suevi spelled with V's, or B's, or I's, or E's, without any one variation being more popular than any of the other. I know I've been inconsistent through the run of this podcast, and I fully intend to continue being inconsistent, probably even within this same episode, so there's that. You might hear Suevi, Suebi, Suebi, Suaves, or Sueba. It is what it is. Moving on. Julius Caesar was the first to mention the Suevi in his reports on the Gallic Wars, and called them the most warlike of the German peoples, who had no permanent settlements and did not till the soil, but lived by animal husbandry, raiding, and hunting, and who were gathering in strength along the upper Rhine near the headwaters of the Danube to threaten the tribes of Gaul. He refers to them as a single people, but later writers disagree. Most agree with Tacitus, writing about 100 years after Caesar, that the Suevi are another confederation of smaller tribes. If you're a fan of Roman history, you may have heard some of the names of the component tribes before, like the Quadi, the Marcomanni, or the Semnones. Tacitus notes that these various tribes share similar languages and occupy a region called Suevia, which seems to have been roughly in the space between the Elbe and Oder rivers. In the reign of Augustus, the Suevi stayed out of the wars of Arminius and so didn't participate in the massacre of the Teutoburg forest. Like other Germanic tribes, the Suevi served in the Roman army as auxiliaries at least as early as the reign of Vespasian in 69 CE. Rising populations in Germania led to a reshuffling in ways that are poorly understood, and triggered migrations and rearrangements of tribal loyalties. The Marcomannic Wars were fought partly in response to such migrations in the late 2nd century and involved several Suevic tribes, including the Marcomanni themselves, and new tribal units were formed out of the old Suevic bloc. Some tribes allied with neighbors further west and formed a new confederation known as the Alemanni, while other tribes emerged under the Suevic umbrella, such as the Juthungi and the Langobardi, the latter later to be known as the Lombards. At some point in the late 4th century, a collection of Suevic-speaking peoples, pushed by a large-scale arrival of Goths and their relatives fleeing the Huns, moved westward, and at some point connected with bands of Vandals and Alans on the banks of the Rhine. As always, there is fuzziness in these definitions, and the army that crossed the Rhine probably included people identifying with dozens of smaller tribes or groups who found common cause and gradually coalesced into larger, coherent cultural groups. Suevic peoples of various tribes remained behind in the old lands of Germania and gave their name to the region of Suabia. With such a wide confederation, it shouldn't be surprising that it's hard to nail down cultural features of the Suevi pre their migration. The most well-known feature is undoubtedly the hairstyle known as the Swabian knot. This twisted hairdo is complex to explain verbally, but there are plenty of images available, and it seems to have been mainly worn by higher-status male Sueves. The style is widely attested in Roman artwork and survives on the heads of two bodies: the Osterby man, dated to the late 1st to early 2nd century CE, and the Decken man, dated somewhere between 135 and 385 CE. The presence and condition of those bodies, at that relatively late date, also tells us more about the Suevi than the fact that they appreciated a snappy do. The Osterby man in particular is interpreted as the victim of a human sacrifice. Later writers, notably Hydatius, who we will be with for quite a while today, maintain that the Suevi kept their paganism all the way to their settlement in Hispania, and while there is no mention of human sacrifice in that context that I could find, we have here the first Germanic people since the Franks to clearly maintain their heathenry for a significant time after entering the empire. Later on, that would make them the target of missionaries from both Arian and Catholic churches. It's difficult to say anything definitive about Suevian culture since we are talking about a long stretch of time and a wide variety of tribes, but by the 5th century the Suevi that settled in Galicia had certainly at least begun to occupy permanent abodes. They favored small, widely spread farmsteads in rural areas, judging by Hydatius' statement that in Galicia the barbarians governed over the provinces while the Hispano-Romans were concentrated in the towns and cities. That, combined with the writings of Orosius, gives an overall more peaceful image of the initial settlement than elsewhere in Hispania, with the Suevi, who would have been considerably outnumbered by the local population, working small farms and hiring themselves out as bodyguards to the locals. It's possible that, like the Praetorians or the Mamluks of other eras, it was this protective role that brought them greater political influence as Roman authority rapidly disappeared, leading to a fairly smooth transition from Roman administration to Suevi dominance. But that's all largely speculation, and is not a hill on which I or anyone else will die on. Nor do I want to give the impression that the Suevi were pacifistic in any way, and that they did not raid around and make trouble for their neighbors regularly. That's enough background, I think, so let's get to something that more resembles the political history we're used to, yeah? Hydadeus is pretty much our only source, and frankly the information he offers is pretty weak tea at times, but we will do our best to flesh out as we go. The first king of the Suevi, who led them into Hispania, was a character named Hermeric, who was definitely the band's leader from 419, and probably earlier. There's no solid evidence for his birth or origins. Some believe that he led the Suevi contingent of the Great Army across the Rhine, some that he came to power later. In the absence of anything solid, modern scholars have been free to argue about absolutely everything. First is whether Hermeric and his Suevi arrived in Hispania at the same time as the Vandals and Alans, or if they came separately a year or two later. They seem to have traveled straight through the western passes over the mountains, through the territories of the Basques, and made straight for Galicia without much diversion through the rest of the region. Similarly, there's the question of the relationship with the Roman state. Was there a foedus of some kind in place from an early date, or were the Suevi squatting? Hydadeus tells us that in 411, the barbarian peoples decided that the lands they would rule by lot, though what exactly that means in practice is again disputed, and that is the only textual evidence of how the Suevi may have come to occupy the northwest. According to Hydadeus, only the western part of Galicia was given to Hermeric, and he made Braga his capital, with the east then being settled by the Hasdingi Vandals. If an agreement had existed, it seems to have pretty conclusively broken down by 416, as the Visigoths waged war on Vandal and Suevi alike on behalf of Rome. We've heard about this war before, so I won't go into detail about it, and the Visigoths achieved their objectives to Roman satisfaction by 418 and were recalled to settle in Aquitaine. All we can really know about Hermeric is that he was a warrior king, and in 419 pivoted deftly from war with the Visigoths to war with the Vandals, though that went poorly for him, and the Vandals pressed the Suevi hard until Roman intervention came again, with the resulting agreement removing the Hasdingi Vandals from Galicia and relocating south to Baetica to take up coastal raiding. Hermeric's activities in the following decades are obscure. He doesn't show up in Hydadeus' chronicle again until 430, but not much seems to have changed in the meantime. The entry reads, "The Suevi under their king Hermeric plundered the middle regions of Galicia, but their men were partly slaughtered and partly taken captive by the people who held the better protected forts." The previous status quo seemed to have still been in place. The Hispano-Romans holed up in their cities and fortresses, the Suevi ruling the countryside, though it does raise the question of how were those cities being fed. The total population of Suevi couldn't possibly have been large enough to produce the agricultural needs to support urban life, even on the reduced scale of the late Empire world, surely. Archaeology may give us a partial answer here. Like in Italy and all around the Western Empire, there is evidence that the forums and large houses were being put to new use. The large rooms of great houses were subdivided, many used for storage or the processing of food, and some agriculture was brought inside the walls of the city. There is almost no evidence of new construction in the period. Even with smaller populations and home production, though, there must have been a population of peasants out there producing food, both to feed the cities and for the Suevi to buy or steal. But the Suevi did also have their own farms. A peace between the Suevi and the Galician locals was finally brokered when those locals sent an emissary to our old friend Flavius Aetius asking for help. That emissary was none other than our own source, Bishop Hydadeus, who was able to return from his mission with an imperial legate, Censorius by name, in tow. Negotiations were successful and a peace was settled between the Suevi and Galicians. But the details of this peace are utterly absent from Hydadeus' chronicle, which is irritating since he must have had first-hand knowledge of the negotiations. All we do know is that the Galicians gave hostages, which is interesting in itself as hostages are usually used as assurances of good behavior, and it was the Suevi who were the ones that had been raiding. It could be that this was simply a slightly less violent form of extortion. You want your son to stay as two-handed as he is? Make sure those grain shipments keep coming. Hermeric's time as leader of the Suevi was a time of seemingly unrelieved conflict, and it may have weighed on him. After enduring years of some unspecified illness, the old warrior finally decided to hang up his sword in 438, and he passed lordship of the Suevi to his son, Recula. The old king would die in 441. How old he was is moot, but somewhere in his 40s is probable. Where Hermeric had maintained his people in place and kept them together and provided for them, Recula was more ambitious, and immediately began working to increase the number of communities from which he could demand tribute, which really, at this stage, is what those maps marked Suevi or Visigoth really mean. Recula got off to a flying start, defeating the Roman Comes Hispanorum, the Count of Hispania, in an open battle at the Rio Genil, which is down south in Baetica, and profitably plundering the countryside. The next year, taking advantage of Roman weakness and absence of central control, he occupied Merida, the capital of Lusitania, and made it his new capital. Not even slowing down to sample the local olive oil, by 441 Recula was in Seville, and according to Hydadeus, subjected the Baetican and Carthaginian provinces under his power. Taken at face value, that's quite a coming out, from just Galicia to all of Hispania except for Tarraconensis in just 3 years. Now, just for a bit of context and orientation, in 441, the year that Recula entered Seville, the Western Empire was under the legal leadership of Valentinian III and the de facto leadership of Aetius, and his energy was focused on the threat posed by the newly recognized Vandal kingdom in Africa. In the east, Attila was making a name for himself by sacking Constanta on the lower Danube, which is to say that Rome was a bit distracted at the time. The Comes who had been killed on the Genil was replaced by a new man named Asturias, but in the face of all this Suevic expansion, he spent most of his energy fighting Bagaudae rebels in southern Tarraconensis, not facing off against Recula, which is a nice reminder that while we focus on the migrating hordes of barbarians, barbarian invasions were not the only issue facing the Roman state. Relations with the Roman state were likewise not the only concern of the Suevi. In 445, the area around modern Vigo in Galicia was pillaged by a seaborne raid. Hydadeus identifies the culprits as Vandals, which would indicate they had pushed out beyond Gibraltar and were raiding the Atlantic coasts. But few other chroniclers mention such activities on the part of the Vandals, and given that the Frankish and Saxon pirates were active all along the coast of Gaul, it's equally likely that the raid on Galicia was their doing. Suevic aggression against the Roman territories was still ongoing, though. Conflict between Roman, Visigoth, and Suevi waxed and waned. In 446, Asturias fell to court intrigue in Ravenna and was recalled. He was replaced by a new commander named Vitus, who pushed back against the Suevi's dominance in Carthaginensis and in Baetica with Visigothic support. But Recula defeated Vitus's Visigothic allies, and he was forced to withdraw. The Suevi then plundered the territories with renewed enthusiasm. Recula died in 448, and Hydadeus notes that he died a heathen, as his father had. As I noted before, the Suevi held on to their pagan beliefs longer than did the other Germanic peoples entering the empire. That doesn't mean that we know much about their actual practices, of course, as the chroniclers were uniformly hostile to them and uninterested in recording the minutiae of Germanic paganism. In a bit of a turn-up, Recula was succeeded by his son Reciar, who was not only a Christian, but a Catholic Christian. The exact date of his conversion isn't known, but it certainly predates Clovis's conversion to Catholicism by half a century. He almost certainly wasn't raised a Christian, but may have been pushed to convert by his father in order to improve relations with the local bishops. If the accession of this religiously acceptable king raised hopes for a quieter life in Hispania, then those hopes were dashed immediately. Reciar wasn't going to let religion get in the way of his most important duties as king of the Suevi, namely to keep the supplies and riches flowing to his followers and keep and grow their loyalty. Hydadeus was emphatically not a fan. Maybe partly because Reciar appears to have made no serious effort to bring his people along in converting to Catholicism, and maybe because of his marriage in 449 to an Arian daughter of the Visigothic king Theodoric I. This power couple at the top had close to zero effect on the religious character of the Suevi, most of whom maintained their allegiance to the old gods. Raids on Tarraconensis, now in cooperation with the Visigoths, were also a nuisance to Roman administrators, and Reciar's willingness to sometimes fight alongside Bagaudae rebels may have been yet another driver of Roman antipathy. In spite of Hydadeus' disapproval, Reciar wasn't all mindless violence. Don't get me wrong, there was a lot of mindless violence, like 80%. But Reciar's Catholic education, whenever he acquired it, would have come along as a package deal with a Roman-style education. And as I've gone on and on about, a Roman education was the first step out of barbarism. Reciar was also the first Suevic king we know of to issue his own coinage, minted at the capital in Braga. The thin silver coins bear a bust of Honorius, which is slightly odd since he'd been dead for 25 years by then, and are informed indistinguishable from Roman coins, except for the inscription on the reverse, which reads, "By order of King Ricarius." As in Gaul at the same time, the fiction of loyalty to the empire was still being maintained, while at the same time the authority of the local warlord was being reinforced. The problem was the Visigoths were the official barbarians of the West, especially after the assassination of Aetius and Valentinian III. Taking advantage of the ensuing chaos, Retiar brought war to Carthaginensis all the way up to the borders of Tarraconensis, probably intending to conquer the entirety of Hispania. The way Jordanes tells it, Retiar assumed that his family connection to the royal house of the Visigoths would guarantee his rule over Hispania, as the Visigoths were expanding their rule of southern Gaul. Maybe such a relationship existed between him and his father-in-law Theodoric I, but there was no such indulgence on the part of Theodoric's successor, Theodoric II, who was Retiar's brother-in-law and who had bigger fish to fry. Theodoric II, if you cast your mind back, had acclaimed his friend Avitus, a Gallo-Roman senator, as emperor and was fighting hard to keep his man in power. Regaining the wealth of Hispania would be key to restoring the Western Empire, and Theodoric undertook that project on Avitus's behalf. In 456, Theodoric II invaded Hispania with a mixed force of Visigoths, Burgundians, and Franks, driving westward across Tarraconensis toward the Galician core of Suevi territory. On the 5th of October, Retiar met them at the river Orbico, east of Astorga. The battle was a disaster for Retiar, who was wounded and forced to flee all the way to the coast, to Porto. The Visigoths paused to sack Braga at the end of October before tracking Retiar down. He was found in Porto and executed. His birth date is unknown, but he was probably in his 40s when he died, and had led the Suevi for 10 years. From his episcopal seat in Chaves, just 80 miles from Braga, Hydadeus probably had first-hand knowledge of the sack. He noted that it was not terribly bloody, but was grievous and lamentable. The Arian Visigoths robbed the local clergy and stripped the churches, though they stopped short of defiling the nuns. Many captives, most of them Hispano-Romans, were taken as slaves, and the churches converted to stables for the Visigoth livestock, which we've seen before. What we haven't seen before is the inclusion of camels in the list of said livestock, which I thought was interesting and points to still robust trade with Africa. Once Retiar was dealt with, Theodoric turned south and reached Merida, but refrained from plundering it. Hydadeus says that he was stopped by a sign from St. Eulalia, and who knows, maybe that's true. Apparently feeling that he had made his point, the Visigoths pulled back toward Aquitaine, pillaging as they went. Hydadeus made particular mention of Astorga and Palencia, and by the time they reached Gaul, Theodoric's army was weighed down with plunder and slaves. In the absence of any central authority, Galicia descended into chaos. The Suevi split into two factions, each electing their own king, whose names I won't trouble you with. Banditry became endemic, not the concentrated banditry of a single army, but local and more widely troublesome banditry. Each of the two Suevic factions attempted to make peace with the Roman Galicians, but no one seemed capable of keeping their word to one another, and betrayal and massacre followed. The days of Retiar plundering all around the edges of his domains probably began to seem like a dream to the inhabitants of Hispania, who now endured a diffuse civil war. There was little to differentiate the claimants to Suevic leadership in Hydadeus' chronicle. All of them are accused of perfidy, of murder, and of atrocity. Hydadeus himself was captured by one named Frumarius, and though he gives the date of this indignity, July 26, 460, he doesn't tell us anything else about the conditions of his captivity. He was released 3 months later by the grace of God who showed mercy, and if you'll forgive my cynicism, probably also the payment of a ransom. On top of all this domestic strife, Theodoric II regularly sent armies into Hispania, all the way down to Baetica, to raid and sometimes colonize and generally stir up trouble. These were probably the beginnings of those adventurous young Visigoth lords I mentioned last episode. Theodoric simultaneously set himself up as a mediator in the civil war and received ambassadors from the various factions, though nothing ever came of any of those meetings. Finally, in 465, more or less by attrition rather than any great military or political skill, a Suevi lord named Remismund emerged as king. All the other options had simply eliminated themselves or each other. Remismund was recognized by Theodoric, who sent a noblewoman to marry him, though her name and relationship to the Visigothic king is unknown. The Civil War had devastated the Suevi's power and standing in Hispania, and enhanced the Visigoths, just as Theodoric had intended. While permanent Visigothic settlement was still light, Hydattius notes an increasing frequency of diplomatic missions sent to Theodoric, who became the arbiter in disputes between the Roman and Suevi populations in all the territories, except for Galicia itself. The Suevi were back in the box they'd started in. They still raided south into Lusitania, even occupying Lisbon at one point, but any hope of ruling all Hispania was shrinking in the rearview mirror. In another sign of increasing Visigothic domination, around 466, Remismund requested Arian missionaries from Theodoric. Theodoric was more than happy to oblige. Such a request all but acknowledged Theodoric's superiority and indicated a determined turn away from Rome. The Visigoths were the power to be reckoned with in the West now. The opinions of Ravenna were more and more only an afterthought. Most of the Suevi nobility converted to Arianism in the next few years. Hydattius's chronicle breaks off abruptly in 468, and with it goes our only direct textual account of the Suevi kingdom for nearly 100 years. Even Isidore of Seville can only tell us that many kings ruled Galicia between 470 and 550. Hydattius leaves us with one of the many signs and miracles that are sprinkled throughout his writing. Hydattius was into signs and miracles. He records a sign or portent on average every 2.5 years, which is downright sedate compared to Gregory of Tours, who noted about 3 a year, but they do jump out to the modern reader. It was widely accepted at the time, both that the natural world mirrored human affairs, and that God sent messages through that natural world. Thus, bizarre occurrences could either announce disorder or predict. While the concept was generally accepted, the degree of interest in these kind of things varied from chronicler to chronicler, and Hydattius and Gregory were on the intense end of the scale. The last one that Hydattius records and leaves us with is good and weird, so I thought just for fun I would include it to give you a flavor of the kind of thing I'm talking about. And I'll just read the entry in full. Also, some signs and portents were seen in the places of Galicia. At the river Minius, about 5 miles from the municipality of Lace, 4 fish of new sight and appearance were captured. As reported by the Christian and religious men who had caught them, these fish were marked with Hebrew and Greek letters, as well as the Latin numbers of era, such that they contain the cycle of the year, 365, with an equal interval of months. Not far from the aforementioned municipality, some form of grains that were very green like grass, and shaped like lentils, and full of bitterness, fell from the sky. There were also many other signs that would take a while to mention. Okay, I have questions, as I'm sure you do. Starting with, how did Galician fishermen know both Hebrew and Greek? There isn't space to talk about these questions or the other strange happenings that Hydattius records, alas, and they take us away from the main storyline, but they all connect back to the learned bishop's conviction that the apocalypse was near at hand, and many of them can be interpreted as perverse reversals of well-known miracles elsewhere. In this case, perhaps the lentils from the sky are meant to evoke the manna from the book of Exodus. That's according to scholar Richard Burgess. There's much more to get into here, and it really doesn't belong in political history, but I thought it added color, so if you'd like to hear more about this kind of thing, let me know. Once Hydattius went to his eternal reward, the veil of history descends on western Iberia. The Suevi kingdom carried on, but exactly what was going on inside it is impossible to see. Its frontiers shrank, its population Christianized, but that's all we can really know for sure. Conflicts with the Visigoths continued and intensified once the latter were driven out of Gaul. Even the conversion to Catholic Christianity, which you would think would be well recorded by the clerical historians, has multiple conflicting accounts attached to it. One credits a king named Theodemar with the help of St. Martin of Braga. Gregory of Tours names a king called Cararic with the help of relics of St. Martin of Tours, which shouldn't be surprising given what we already know about Gregory's obsessions. John of Biclaro, meanwhile, gives credit to a Visigothic missionary about 580, but that's much later than the other evidence allows, and also happens to coincide with the integration of the Suevic kingdom into the Visigothic kingdom. So you can see that each of these stories has either a political or theological axe to grind, so it's hard to know how much is reliable, if any of it is. So, there you have it, a history of the Suevi and the Suevic kingdom in 30 minutes or less. It kind of peters out at the end there, doesn't it? I'm sorry about that. That's just the way the history reads. Much of this was simplified, of course, and there's plenty of scholarly argumentation about almost all of the things I've said. So it is with most of the history we've talked about on this show. But now at least I feel like I've done some little bit to lay the ghost to the Suevi, and I won't feel guilty every time I look at the top left corner of Hispania from now on. Next time, we'll be back with the Visigoths to see how things look from the winning side. That will be in 2 weeks, if all goes well. In the meantime, check out Instagram, where I am at DarkAgesPod, and if you're feeling generous, you can visit ko-fi.com/darkagespod, that's ko-fi.com, to leave a tip and buy me a coffee. Thanks to regular contributors there, Paul, Scott, Jesse, Brendan, Alex, Dusty, John, Barchester, and a hearty welcome to Susan. It also wouldn't hurt my feelings if you were to head over to manscaped.com and enter that discount code DARKAGES at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. Until next time, take care.